Colombia is waking up to devastation this week after a massive 7.4 magnitude earthquake tore through the western part of the country, killing at least 132 people, injuring more than 570, and reducing entire neighborhoods to rubble in a matter of seconds. This is now being called the strongest earthquake to hit Colombia in this century. And as rescue crews dig through collapsed buildings, from Cali to Manizales, officials are warning that the death toll is almost certain to keep climbing. In this video, we're breaking down exactly what happened, why it was so destructive, and what it means for a region that is still recovering from a completely separate earthquake disaster just weeks earlier in neighboring Venezuela. The quake struck at 7:34 in the morning, local time, on Monday, catching millions of Colombians in the middle of their morning routines, getting kids ready for school, commuting to work, opening shops. According to the United States Geological Survey, the epicenter was located near the small mountain town of San José del Palmar, a community of only around 4,800 people, tucked into the Chocó region, roughly 250 miles, or about 400 kilometers, west of the capital Bogota. Colombia's own geological service placed the depth of the rupture at somewhere between 96 and 107 kilometers, a relatively deep origin point that still managed to send violent rolling shockwaves across an enormous stretch of the country. To put that in perspective, this wasn't a shallow, localized quake. It was deep enough and strong enough that the shaking reached major cities hundreds of kilometers away, with enough force to bring down buildings. And it was felt not just across Colombia, but across the border in Ecuador, in Panama, and in Venezuela as well. In Bogota, the situation could have been catastrophic, but the capital was largely spared the worst of it. Car alarms and building alarms went off across the city as residents rushed out into the streets in a panic. And for a few tense minutes, nobody knew how bad things really were.
Padre Santo, protégenos, Dios mío. Protégenos, Señor. Protégenos, Dios mío. Protégenos, Padre. Protégenos, Dios.
The mayor later confirmed there were no reports of serious injuries or major structural collapse in the capital, just scattered cracks in some buildings. Because Bogota escaped relatively unscathed, the city has since redirected its own emergency resources and personnel to support the regions that weren't so lucky. And unfortunately, there were several. The worst destruction was concentrated in the western and central parts of the country, particularly in Colombia's famous coffee-growing region known as the Eje Cafetero. The city of Pereira, capital of the Risaralda department, has emerged as the deadliest single location in this disaster, with local officials reporting around 60 deaths in that city alone, according to the latest update from the Colombian Association of Capital Cities. Video from Pereira's airport showed ceiling panels crashing down on travelers as they screamed and scrambled for cover, and witnesses described entire blocks lined with collapsed stores, homes, and residential buildings. In Manizales, in the neighboring Caldas department, the earthquake produced one of the most haunting images of the entire disaster. Footage capturing the tower of the city's historic cathedral crumbling and falling in real time, a symbol of just how violently the ground shook in that part of the country. Colombia's vice president has since traveled to Manizales personally to lead the government's unified command post, coordinating the national emergency response from the heart of one of the hardest-hit areas. Then there's Cali, Colombia's third-largest city, home to roughly 2 million people. The mayor there reported that residents were trapped inside at least 19, and by some counts as many as 20, collapsed buildings, with witnesses describing entire clouds of dust rising over the skyline as one structure after another gave way. As of the latest reports, as many as 188 people are listed as missing in Cali alone, and rescue teams have been working around the clock, passing chunks of concrete and rubble, hand to hand, down long human chains of volunteers, just to reach anyone who might still be trapped underneath. A hospital in the city also suffered severe damage, with one of its wings partially collapsing, forcing staff to evacuate patients in the middle of emergency care. Near the epicenter itself, communication has been one of the biggest obstacles to understanding the true scale of the damage. In Chocó, one of Colombia's poorest and most remote, just lived through the strongest earthquake in the town's entire recorded history, describing the local health center as completely overwhelmed by the number of injured people arriving for treatment.
Oh my God. What happened? Oh. Oh.
As search and rescue operations pushed forward through the day, the confirmed death toll didn't just rise, it kept climbing sharply, hour after hour. Early reports on Monday put the number of dead at around 20. Within hours, that number jumped past 100. By Monday evening, Colombia's newly inaugurated president, Abelardo de la Espriella, confirmed that at least 132 people had died, making this the earthquake disaster of his young presidency, and by far the deadliest natural disaster Colombia has faced in more than a decade. Nationwide, more than 86 buildings have completely collapsed, and over 1,600 homes have been damaged or destroyed. 7 airports across the country, including those in Cali, Manizales, Pereira and Quibdó, were forced to suspend operations entirely. Adding to the fear on the ground, the main quake was followed by a series of aftershocks, with the U.S. Geological Survey recording at least 21 separate tremors within hours, including one measuring 5.0 that struck less than an hour after the initial quake. For residents already dealing with the trauma of watching buildings fall around them, every aftershock brings a fresh wave of panic and raises the very real risk of already weakened structures finally giving way completely. Emergency officials have urged people across the hardest-hit areas to stay out of damaged buildings entirely, until proper structural inspections can be carried out. What makes this disaster even more unsettling is the timing. This earthquake hit Colombia just weeks after a completely separate and even deadlier disaster struck next door in Venezuela, where twin earthquakes measuring magnitude 7.2 and 7.5 destroyed hundreds of buildings and killed more than 6,300 people in late June. For many Colombians who watched that devastation unfold just across the border, living through their own major earthquake so soon afterward has been described as deeply unnerving, a stark reminder that this entire region sits along the Pacific Ring of Fire, the horseshoe-shaped zone circling the Pacific Ocean, where a huge share of the planet's earthquakes and volcanic eruptions occur. The international response has already begun to take shape. The United States State Department announced it is committing $15.5 million towards shelter, food, protection, and emergency assistance for those affected. Colombian singer Karol G also spoke out, saying her foundation is working to find the best way to support affected families on the ground. Meanwhile, President de la Espriella has declared a state of national disaster, mobilizing what he described as the country's entire military and police apparatus, deploying engineers, search dogs, and rescue teams to the hardest-hit regions, and personally traveling to Chocó, one of the country's most historically neglected areas, promising rental subsidies for displaced families, and pledging that the region would, in his words, never again be treated as the forgotten land. As of the latest updates, search and rescue operations remain active across Pereira, Cali, Manizales and Quibdó, with hospitals reporting they are stretched thin by the sheer number of injured arriving for treatment. Displaced families are now seeking shelter wherever they can find it, and officials have made clear that the final death toll is likely to rise further as communication is restored with more isolated mountain communities near the epicenter. With aftershocks still rattling the region and the memory of Venezuela's devastating earthquakes still fresh, Colombia now finds itself facing one of the most difficult recovery efforts in its modern history. We'll continue tracking this story as new information comes in, so make sure you're subscribed for the latest updates. Let us know in the comments, do you think the death toll here ends up passing what we saw in Venezuela? Yes or no? Stay with us, because what's happening across this region right now is far from over.